The Margraviate of Brandenburg emerged as a critical territorial entity on the northeastern periphery of the Holy Roman Empire, functioning as a primary march for the expansion of Germanic political authority into Slavic territories. This administrative region, often referred to as the Nordmark, was formalized under the Ascanian dynasty, specifically following the 1157 military conquest of the fortress of Brandenburg by Albert the Bear. The early political structure of the Margraviate was defined by its status as an imperial fief, which granted the margraves significant autonomy in judicial and fiscal matters compared to the interior principalities of the empire. By the mid-13th century, the Golden Bull of 1356 officially elevated the margraves to the rank of prince-electors, a constitutional designation that integrated them into the narrow college of 7 high nobles, responsible for selecting the Holy Roman Emperor. This political assent required the establishment of a robust, centralized bureaucracy capable of managing the high costs of imperial diplomacy and the continuous fortification of the Mark. The transition of authority from the Ascanian house to the Wittelsbachs in the early 14th century coincided with a period of severe demographic and economic volatility. The Great Famine and the Black Death had significantly depleted the peasant labor force, leading to a structural decline in manorial revenues derived from the traditional feudal corvée system. To counteract this fiscal erosion, the electorate sought to diversify its revenue streams by fostering a more diverse urban population and establishing formal trade monopolies. The geography of the Mark, characterized by the marshy basin of the Havel and Spree rivers, necessitated the development of specialized hydraulic management and the creation of commercial hubs like Berlin-Cologne and Frankfurt an der Oder. These urban centers were granted specific municipal charters, or Stadtrecht, which exempted them from certain manorial dues and allowed for the formation of merchant guilds under the direct oversight of the sovereign. The administrative priority of the 15th century electors, particularly under the Hohenzollern dynasty, which assumed control in 1415, was the standardization of the tax cadaster. This effort involved the implementation of the Landesmatrikel, a comprehensive register designed to quantify the taxable capacity of the various estates, including the clergy, the petty nobility, and the nascent urban bourgeoisie. The state's fiscal necessity was further exacerbated by the Fehde culture, the localized private wars among the knights, which frequently disrupted agricultural production and necessitated expensive military interventions by the electors' regular forces. The Hohenzollerns utilized their legal authority to enforce the public peace, a policy that centralized the right to exert force and formalized the judicial system under the superior court. In Köln, this drive for institutional stability created a legal vacuum regarding liquid credit, as the ecclesiastical courts maintained rigid prohibitions against usury for the Christian populace, leaving the state without a domestic mechanism for short-term capital financing. Consequently, the Margraviate entered the late Middle Ages as a strategically vital but financially strained state, where the pursuit of administrative uniformity and fiscal solvency became the primary drivers of imperial policy. The deliberate invitation of Jewish financiers into the Margraviate of Brandenburg was a calculated response to the structural limitations of the medieval Germanic economy, which remained largely tethered to agrarian barter and localized manorial obligations. while the landed nobility derived their status from the control of territory and the extraction of grain surpluses, the Ascanian and early Hohenzollern electors identified a critical deficit in the availability of liquid specie necessary for state building. The canonical ban on usury, rigorously enforced by the Catholic Church across the Holy Roman Empire, precluded Christian subjects from the professional lending of money for interest, thereby creating a vacuum in the capital market. To circumvent this ecclesiastical constraint, the Margraves utilized their sovereign prerogative to grant residency permits to Jewish merchants and bankers who were legally positioned outside the canonical jurisdiction. These individuals functioned as essential economic intermediaries, possessing the capacity to mobilize capital through transnational kinship networks that extended from the Rhenish centers to the Baltic ports. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? The recruitment of this non-feudal population was formalized through the issuance of protective charters, or Schutzbriefe, which defined the specific fiscal and legal conditions of their presence. Unlike the peasantry, who were bound to the soil through serfdom, the Jewish community was recognized as a mobile and commercially active class that owed its allegiance directly to the elector's treasury. This relationship was inherently transactional. The Margraves provided physical security and the right to conduct trade in exchange for high-interest loans and substantial annual protection taxes. These funds were instrumental in financing the transition from a feudal military retinue to a more professionalized administrative state, allowing the electors to purchase the loyalty of mercenary captains and fund the expansion of the central chancellery. The presence of Jewish capital enabled the state to undertake large-scale infrastructure projects, such as the initial dredging of the Havel waterways and the construction of state-managed salt refineries, which required significant upfront investment before generating taxable revenue. Furthermore, the Margraves recognized that the integration of Jewish expertise in bullion and minting was vital for maintaining the stability of the local currency. The Brandenburg denarius often suffered from debasement and regional fragmentation, undermining public confidence in the markets. By utilizing Jewish financiers as masters of the mint and advisors on currency exchange, the electors were able to standardize weights and measures, thereby increasing the volume of trade flowing through the mark. This economic specialization also extended to the procurement of luxury commodities and military supplies from the Levant and the Italian city-states, goods that the traditional guild-based merchants of Berlin were often unable to source due to a lack of international credit lines. The Jewish community thus provided a sophisticated financial architecture that bridged the gap between the insular agrarian world of the German North and the burgeoning commercial networks of Europe. The legal categorization of the community as camerae servi ensured that their wealth remained a captive asset of the sovereign. The electors maintained a meticulously documented inventory of Jewish assets, treating the community's total capital as a financial reservoir that could be tapped during periods of acute imperial necessity. When the state required immediate funds for the defense of the march or to satisfy the demands of the emperor, the Margrave could levy extraordinary tallages, effectively reclaiming a portion of the interest earned on private loans. This systemic extraction created a symbiotic, albeit precarious, relationship. The Jewish community provided the liquid credit essential for the modernization of the Brandenburg state, while the state provided the legal shielding necessary for the accumulation of that capital. By the late 15th century, this financial integration had reached such a depth that the sovereign's ability to project power was inextricably linked to the continued productivity and liquidity of his Jewish subjects. The legal framework defining the presence of the Jewish community within the Holy Roman Empire was anchored in the doctrine of servi camerae imperialis, or servants of the imperial chamber. This unique juridical status, formalized during the 12th and 13th centuries, established a direct personal link between the Jewish population and the emperor, effectively removing them from the jurisdiction of regional ecclesiastical courts and local municipal law. The definitive codification of this status occurred under Emperor Frederick II in 1236, following a series of violent outbreaks in the Rhineland. Frederick's decree asserted that because the Jewish community was excluded from the feudal hierarchy and the protection of the Pax Christiana, they fell under the immediate and exclusive guardianship of the imperial crown. This was not a designation of chattel slavery, but a sophisticated mechanism of political protection, granting the community a secure, albeit singular, place within the fragmented constitutional structure of the empire. In Brandenburg, this imperial doctrine was localized through the elector's right to exercise regalia, or sovereign rights, delegated by the central authority in Vienna. By the 15th century, the Hohenzollern electors had successfully asserted that the Jewish community residing within the March belonged specifically to the elector's chamber rather than the emperor's directly. This legal appropriation allowed the Brandenburg court to issue its own safe conducts, known as Geleitbrief, which functioned as enforceable contracts of residence. These documents specified that any injury committed against a Jewish subject was to be adjudicated as an assault upon the elector's personal property and his public peace. This centralized protection was critical in an era where local knights and town councils frequently attempted to impose arbitrary tolls or restrictive trade ordinances. By claiming exclusive jurisdiction, the electors ensured that the community remained a closed fiscal entity, protected from the competing interests of the regional estates. The jurisdictional insulation provided by the servi camerae status created a specialized legal environment for financial dispute resolution. While Christian commercial litigation was often mired in the slow-moving canon law courts, Jewish Christian debts in Brandenburg were adjudicated by the Kammergericht, the elector's supreme court. This ensured that credit contracts were enforced with administrative speed, as the state's own revenue was frequently tied to the successful collection of these private obligations. However, this legal sanctuary was fundamentally precarious. It was a privilege granted by the sovereign rather than an inherent right of the subject. The elector possessed the unilateral authority to amend or revoke these protections, making the community's safety entirely dependent on its perceived utility to the state's current fiscal needs. Furthermore, the status of chamber servants imposed a rigid social and geographic isolation that prevented the integration of the community into the broader civic fabric. While the guild members of Berlin and the peasantry of the Uckermark operated under the common law of the land, The Jewish population existed in a state of legal exceptionalism. They were required to pay the Leibzoll, a body tax for safe passage, and were subject to the Goldener Opferpfennig, an imperial tax that symbolized their subordination to the imperial chamber. This distinction reinforced the perception of the community as an alien element within the German realm, physically present but legally and spiritually distinct. This legal architecture, while providing the necessary stability for capital accumulation, simultaneously entrenched the community's vulnerability. It created a situation where the Jewish resident was a highly valued royal asset during times of economic growth, but became a politically convenient target for expropriation once the state's administrative goals shifted toward religious and social uniformity. The establishment of Jewish residency within the Margraviate was defined by a strategic concentration in the primary, administrative, and commercial nodes of the Mark, most notably Berlin-Cologne and Spandau. These urban centers, functioning as the electorate's logistical heart, required the presence of a stable financier class to facilitate the transition from localized markets to a regional trading system. The spatial organization of these early settlements followed the Vicus Judaeorum model, where residential and commercial activities were centered around a designated street or district. In Berlin, this area was situated in close proximity to the merchant districts and the developing administrative offices of the town council, ensuring that Jewish intermediaries remained accessible for daily fiscal transactions. This urban footprint was not merely a result of communal preference, but was dictated by the Margrave's need for efficient oversight and the rapid collection of the various residency taxes and commercial imposts. A defining characteristic of these Jewish quarters was the emergence of domus lapidae, or stone-built houses, which served as a stark architectural contrast to the surrounding timber frame and wattle and daub structures of the general populace. While the use of stone was traditionally reserved for ecclesiastical buildings and royal fortifications, the wealthiest Jewish families invested heavily in durable, fire-resistant construction. These stone edifices functioned as fortified strongpoints, providing necessary security for the accumulation of bullion, precious metal collateral, and the extensive ledgers recording the realm's private indebtedness. The existence of these permanent, high-value structures indicated a commitment to long-term residency that moved beyond the transient nature of early medieval peddling. In Spandau, the Jewish quarter was located near the citadel, benefiting from the immediate proximity of the Margrave's military garrison, which acted as a deterrent against the periodic civil unrest that targeted the urban elite. The internal infrastructure of these districts was meticulously planned to meet the requirements of both Jewish civil law and the elector's administrative mandates. The Judenstrasse was often gated not solely for segregation, but to facilitate the Eruv, the legal boundary required for movement on the Sabbath, and to secure the community's assets during the frequent nighttime curfews. Within these enclaves, the community established a decentralized network of private vaults and counting houses, which functioned as the primary engines of local liquidity. These buildings often housed the official scales used for weighing coins and assessing the purity of precious metals, a critical technical function in an era of diverse and often unreliable mintages. The urban foothold thus transformed the Jewish community into a permanent fixture of the Brandenburg cityscape, integrating them into the physical fabric of the towns, even as they remained legally and socially distinct. Furthermore, the concentration of Jewish families in these strategic centers enabled the electors to implement the ARCA system of record-keeping, where every bond and loan agreement was required to be registered in a public chest. By localizing the community within a specific urban quarter, the state's auditors could conduct periodic inventories of Jewish wealth with high precision. The physical proximity of the Jewish financiers to the municipal ratush and the royal chancellery facilitated a constant flow of intelligence regarding market conditions and the financial solvency of the local nobility. This urban integration was a fundamental prerequisite for the sophisticated credit operations that underpinned the Hohenzollerns' territorial ambitions. Consequently, the development of these stone-built quarters represented the physical manifestation of a symbiotic relationship where the Jewish community's superior architectural and technical capital was harnessed to build the foundational infrastructure of a modernizing German state. The transition from transient residency to permanent communal integration within the Margraviate was institutionalized through the construction of the skola, or synagogue, and the mikveh, the ritual bath. These structures represented a definitive departure from the early mobile merchant phase of settlement, signifying a multi-generational commitment to the Brandenburg urban landscape. Under the halakhic requirements governing communal life, the establishment of a dedicated place of worship was the primary administrative act of any recognized kehillah. In Berlin and Spandau, these buildings were often integrated into the residential blocks of the Jewish quarter, yet they functioned as the central nexus for religious, judicial, and educational activities. The synagogue was not merely a liturgical space, it served as the Beth Din, the internal court where rabbinic judges issued binding rulings on civil and familial disputes, operating under the elector's grant of internal autonomy. Architecturally, the infrastructure of faith required significant capital investment and the acquisition of permanent land titles, a process that necessitated explicit royal permission. The elector's chancellery issued specific concessions for the purchase of plots, often located in the interior of the city blocks, to maintain a degree of public discretion while securing the community's right to build. The construction of the ritual bath involved sophisticated hydraulic engineering, as it required a continuous supply of living water from natural sources or groundwater, a technical challenge in the sandy soil of the Mark. The successful operation of these facilities indicated the community's mastery of the local environment and its ability to sustain the complex requirements of Jewish purity laws. These buildings were the physical manifestations of a state within a state, where the electors' camera servi managed their internal affairs through an organized, tax-paying hierarchy. The educational infrastructure of the community was centered within the Beit Midrash, or study hall, often housed within the synagogue complex. This institution ensured the transmission of Talmudic jurisprudence and Hebrew literacy, creating a specialized intellectual class capable of managing the community's legal and commercial documentation. In university towns like Frankfurt an der Oder, this intellectual presence created a unique interface with the Christian academic world, As scholars sought assistance with the Hebraica Veritas for biblical studies, the presence of these learned bodies guaranteed a high degree of communal cohesion and a standardized approach to credit operations across the various settlements of the Mark. The synagogue also functioned as the repository for the community's charity funds and the management of the Hekdesh, the social welfare system that provided for the indigent and the transient merchant population. The final component of this permanent infrastructure was the Beth Olam, the cemetery, established on the periphery of the urban walls. The acquisition of land for burial was a critical legal milestone as it secured the community's ancestral link to the Brandenburg soil. These sites were protected by royal decree as desecration was treated as a violation of the elector's peace and a loss to his fiscal interests. Unlike the Domus Lapidae, which could be sold or mortgaged, the cemetery represented an inalienable communal asset that defined the spiritual and physical boundaries of Jewish presence. By the late 15th century, the existence of these religious and communal buildings had transformed the Jewish presence from a fiscal convenience into a deeply rooted institutional reality. This infrastructure provided the community with the stability necessary to survive periodic shifts in royal favor, yet it also created a visible, high-value target for confiscation once the political climate turned toward total expulsion. The economic functionality of the Jewish community in the late medieval Margraviate was fundamentally defined by its role as the primary provider of liquid credit to the Ritterschaft, or the knightly estate. While the Brandenburg nobility possessed vast territorial holdings, their wealth remained immobilized in agricultural surpluses and manorial labor services, leaving them perpetually deficient in the specie required to meet the demands of a professionalizing military environment. The transition from traditional feudal levies to the Soldnerwesen, the use of mercenary companies, necessitated immediate access to silver and gold for the payment of wages, the procurement of heavy plate armor, and the acquisition of modern siege weaponry. Jewish financiers bridged this liquidity gap by advancing significant sums against the security of the nobles' future harvests, land rents, and even ancestral titles. This financial lubrication allowed the petty aristocracy to maintain their socio-political status and fulfill their military obligations to the Hohenzollern electors during the frequent territorial conflicts in the New March and Pomerania. The mechanisms of this lending were formalized through Schuldbrief, or debt bonds, which were meticulously drafted and often sealed with the heraldry of the borrowing lord. These legal instruments frequently utilized the Verschreibung, a process where a noble would pledge the income from specific villages or mills as collateral for a loan. In instances where the principal could not be repaid, the Jewish creditor was often granted a temporary right of Nutznießung, or usufruct, allowing them to collect the manorial dues directly from the peasantry to satisfy the interest. This arrangement placed the Jewish financier in a position of significant, albeit indirect, authority over the feudal economy, as they became the de facto managers of the revenues flowing from aristocratic estates. The capital provided by these loans also underwrote the physical maintenance of the noble infrastructure. Funds were routinely extended for the repair of castle walls, the construction of stone granaries, and the improvement of rural hydraulic systems necessary for grain processing. Furthermore, the knightly estate relied on Jewish intermediaries for the payment of feudal aids and lensware, the mandatory taxes owed to the elector upon the inheritance of an estate or the marriage of a sovereign's daughter. Since these royal demands were often sudden and required immediate payment in high-grade coinage, the Jewish banker acted as a crucial fiscal safety valve, preventing the forfeiture of noble lands to the crown through default. This financial dependency was not limited to the secular lords. High-ranking ecclesiastical figures and cathedral chapters in Brandenburg also utilized Jewish credit to fund the administrative costs of their dioceses and the expansion of parish architecture. The involvement of Jewish capital thus permeated the entire hierarchical structure of the Mark, enabling the traditional elites to navigate the transition toward a cash-based economy without abandoning their feudal privileges. However, this pervasive indebtedness created a structural tension that would eventually undermine the stability of the community. As the accumulation of interest compounded over generations, many noble houses found themselves in a state of chronic insolvency, with their lands effectively mortgaged to the elector's camerae servii. This fostered a deep-seated resentment among the Ritter, who viewed the Jewish financier not as an essential service provider, but as a parasitic agent who held their ancestral legacy in hostage. The electorate utilized this tension for its own political gain, occasionally declaring Schuldenbrief null and void, or imposing forced settlements to alleviate the pressure on the nobility while simultaneously extracting a moratorium fee from the creditors. By the late 15th century, the financial architecture that had sustained the Brandenburg elite had become a primary source of political instability, as the nobility began to view the expulsion of their creditors as the most efficient means of debt liquidation. The specialized involvement of the Jewish community in the trade of bullion was a technical necessity for the margraviate, occurring during a period of systemic silver famine that characterized the European economy in the late 15th century. As the primary silver mines of the Harz and Erzgebirge regions reached technological limits, the volume of circulating high-grade coinage plummeted, forcing the Brandenburg electors to manage a diverse and often debased inventory of foreign currencies. Jewish bullion dealers functioned as the state's primary assayers, possessing the chemical and metallurgical expertise required to determine the precise fineness of various gold florins, Hungarian ducats, and Rhenish groschen. This technical vetting was critical for the Münzregel, the elector's sovereign right to mint, as it allowed the treasury to maintain a favorable metal ratio and prevent the flight of high-value specie to neighboring jurisdictions. By identifying coins that had been clipped or alloyed with base metals like copper, Jewish experts protected the internal Brandenburg market from the inflationary pressures of a devalued medium of exchange. Furthermore, the Jewish community facilitated the transition from the physical transport of heavy metal to the more abstract and efficient mechanism of the Wechselbrief, or bill of exchange. In an era where the movement of bullion across the bandit-prone post roads of the empire was both dangerous and logistically prohibitive, Jewish merchants utilized their transnational familial and commercial networks to transfer credit across vast distances. A debt incurred in Berlin could be settled in the trade fairs of Leipzig, or the ports of the Hanseatic League through the simple endorsement of a paper instrument, a process that bypassed the need for the physically risky movement of coin. This capacity for international arbitrage allowed the Hohenzollern electors to conduct papal diplomacy and fund imperial ventures without depleting the local supply of circulating Pfennige. The Jewish banking houses essentially functioned as a decentralized central bank, providing the liquidity necessary for the electorate to participate in the burgeoning continental economy of the early modern period. The management of the electors' mints often relied on the administrative and technical oversight of Jewish Münzjuden, who acted as official contractors for the production of state currency. These specialists were responsible for the procurement of raw silver and the management of the refining process, ensuring that the electors' seigniorage, the profit derived from the difference between the coin's face value and its metal content, was maximized. This role required a sophisticated understanding of market fluctuations and the relative value of gold to silver, an area of scholarship where the Jewish community held a distinct advantage due to their continuous engagement with the Mediterranean and Italian banking centers. The involvement of these experts allowed the Brandenburg Treasury to implement periodic currency reforms, withdrawing old, worn coinage from circulation and replacing it with standardized issues that facilitated more predictable tax collection across the various districts of the mark. However, the control of the bullion trade also placed the Jewish community at the center of the era's most volatile economic disputes. The general populace and the minor guilds, often suffering from the effects of currency devaluation and the scarcity of small denomination coins, frequently blamed Jewish speculators for draining the land of good silver. While the electors derived significant revenue from the seigniorage and the exchange fees managed by their Jewish agents, they often allowed these experts to serve as the public face of unpopular fiscal policies. This created a profound irony. The very technical skill that prevented the total collapse of the Brandenburg monetary system was framed by the community's rivals as a form of economic sabotage. By the beginning of the 16th century, the electorate's mastery over its own currency was inextricably linked to the expertise of its Jewish bullion dealers. Yet, the public resentment toward these financial engineers provided the political pretext for the subsequent seizure of their accumulated precious metals. Consequently, the trade in bullion was both the engine of the community's wealth and the definitive marker of its eventual fiscal destruction. The administrative integration of the Jewish community into the fiscal machinery of the Margraviate reached its most public manifestation through the system of Steuerpacht, or tax farming. As the Hohenzollern electors sought to stabilize the annual budgetary requirements of the state, they transitioned from the erratic collection of individual levies to a model of outsourced revenue management. The electorate utilized its regalian rights to auction the collection of indirect taxes, including the Grenzzoll, border customs, Wegzoll, road tolls, and Brückenzoll, bridge tolls, to Jewish contractors who possessed the liquid capital to pay the anticipated revenue in a single upfront installment. This Pacht contract shifted the financial risk from the sovereign's treasury to the individual tax farmer, who was then empowered by royal warrant to extract the authorized fees from all travelers and merchants passing through the strategic choke points of the mark. Consequently, the Jewish tax farmer became an indispensable administrative auditor, ensuring that the volume of trade flowing across the Havel and Spree was meticulously quantified and monetized for the benefit of the state. The physical presence of these Zolljuden at the city gates of Berlin, Köln, and Spandau transformed the Jewish community into the most visible face of the elector's extractive power. Standing at the gatehouses or the river barriers, these agents were responsible for enforcing the Akzise, the consumption tax on imported commodities such as salt, grain, and beer. Every peasant entering the market and every Hanseatic merchant transporting textiles was required to submit their cargo for inspection and pay the mandated percentage to the Jewish farmer. This constant transactional contact with the general populace created a unique social friction, as the Jewish agent was seen as the direct cause of the increasing cost of living, rather than the sovereign who had authorized the levy. While the electorate derived a predictable and guaranteed income from these contracts, the tax farmers bore the brunt of the public's hostility toward the state's fiscal expansion. Furthermore, the management of these tolls required a high degree of bureaucratic literacy and the maintenance of complex Zollregister, or customs ledgers. Jewish tax farmers implemented sophisticated auditing techniques to prevent the widespread evasion of duties, utilizing their knowledge of regional trade routes to identify bypasses known as Schleichweg. They were often authorized to employ armed Zollknechte to patrol the riverbanks and forest paths, a delegated use of state force that further alienated the community from the rural peasantry and the urban artisan classes. This administrative role also extended to the management of Geleitrecht, the safe conduct fees required for the transport of high-value goods, placing Jewish agents in a position of regulatory authority over the very Christian guilds who were their primary economic competitors. The symbiotic nature of the tax farming system ensured that the Jewish community was deeply embedded in the Rentkammer, the central revenue office of the electorate. The data compiled by these tax farmers provided the electors with precise intelligence regarding the commercial vitality of each district, allowing for more targeted fiscal planning and the periodic adjustment of tariff rates. However, this administrative efficiency was achieved at a significant social cost. The Jewish farmer acted as a lightning rod for populist discontent, effectively shielding the Hohenzollern dynasty from the political consequences of heavy taxation. By the turn of the 16th century, the community's role as the visible face of the state's fiscal machinery had become a primary driver of societal alienation, as the common subject increasingly equated the Jewish presence with the burdens of a centralized, extractive government. This perceived association between the Jewish intermediary and the elector's financial demands would ultimately facilitate the political consensus required for the eventual expulsion, as both the urban populace and the indebted nobility found common ground in the removal of the sovereign's tax-collecting agents. The intellectual interface between Jewish rabbinic masters and Christian clerics in the late 15th century Margraviate was propelled by the Ad Fontes movement of Northern humanism, which prioritized the study of original biblical languages over the reliance on the Latin Vulgate. This scholarly confluence was most concentrated in the academic circles surrounding the newly established Viadrina University in Frankfurt an der Oder, founded in 1506. Christian theologians, driven by the desire to uncover the Hebraica Veritas, or the Hebrew truth of the Old Testament, sought out Jewish rabbinic scholars for private instruction in grammar, syntax, and the Masoretic textual tradition. These interactions were characterized by a transactional exchange of philological knowledge rather than a pursuit of ecumenical synthesis. Jewish scholars provided the linguistic keys to deciphering the Hebrew Scriptures, enabling Christian humanists to analyze the nuances of the original text, which was seen as the foundational pillar of theological reform. The methodology of this exchange focused on the mastery of the Hebrew alphabet and the complex system of vocalization marks, or nikud, which was essential for the precise reading of the Torah. Christian clerics engaged in the study of the Mikraot Gedolot, the Rabbinic Bible, which included the Aramaic Targums and the influential commentaries of medieval scholars like Rashi and Abraham ibn Ezra. This engagement allowed Christian Hebraists to incorporate Jewish methods of literal exegesis, known as a shat, into their own biblical interpretations. The Jewish intellectual elite, while culturally isolated, acted as the vital custodians of an ancient philological heritage that was increasingly valued by the Renaissance academic establishment. This scholarly utility provided a secondary layer of communal security, as the intellectual dependency of the Christian elite offered a counterweight to the populist religious hostility emerging in the urban centers. However, the transmission of Hebrew knowledge was strictly regulated by ecclesiastical concerns regarding the potential for spiritual contamination. While the philological tools were coveted, the rabbinic interpretations were frequently viewed with suspicion by the conservative clerical establishment in Brandenburg. The interface was often asymmetrical. Jewish masters were compensated for their linguistic expertise, but were strictly forbidden from engaging in theological debate or proselytization. This boundary ensured that the intersection remained a technical rather than a religious encounter. Christian scholars utilized Hebrew as a weapon in internal academic disputes, often using Jewish textual evidence to challenge established dogmas of the Church, a practice that inadvertently placed the Jewish masters in the middle of volatile Christian factionalism. The accumulation of Hebrew manuscripts and grammars in Christian libraries during this period created a permanent academic record of Jewish scholarship within the Mark. Notable works such as those by Johannes Reuchlin, which drew heavily on Jewish linguistic principles, circulated among the Brandenburg clergy, fostering a brief period of intellectual tolerance at the highest levels of the university. This scholarly interface also facilitated the early printing of Hebrew texts, as Christian printers sought the expertise of Jewish typesetters to ensure the accuracy of the characters. Yet, this intellectual proximity also fueled a specialized form of anxiety. The deeper understanding of Jewish law and ritual provided Christian polemicists with the very data they would later weaponize to construct sophisticated accusations of host desecration and ritual crime. By the early 16th century, the scholarly bridge that had initially linked the synagogue and the university had become a source of technical ammunition for those seeking to prove the inherent hostility of the Jewish faith, transforming intellectual utility into a catalyst for the final administrative crackdown. The absolute dependence of the Jewish community on the personal protection of the Hohenzollern electors constituted a double-edged sword that fundamentally dictated their survival and eventual removal. In the administrative structure of the Margraviate, the Jewish population existed as a fiscal enclave directly attached to the elector's privy purse, a relationship that bypassed the traditional power of the territorial estates, or stände. While the nobility and the town councils possessed constitutional mechanisms to negotiate tax grants through the Landtag, the Jewish community lacked any independent political standing. They were legally categorized as an exclusive asset of the sovereign, meaning their presence was a manifestation of the elector's absolute prerogative. This isolation provided an immediate sanctuary from the competing legal claims of the local counts and bishops, yet it simultaneously transformed the community into a captive revenue stream that the crown could manipulate without legislative oversight. The fiscal extraction from this captive population was structured around a series of extraordinary obligations that exceeded the standard commercial taxes paid by Christian burgesses. Beyond the annual protection fee, or Schutzgeld, the electors implemented a system of coronation taxes and New Year's gifts, which were mandatory financial tributes required to ensure the renewal of residency charters. These levies functioned as a form of flexible capital for the Hohenzollerns, providing the liquid funds necessary to circumvent the fiscal restrictions imposed by the Brandenburg nobility. Because the electorate was chronically undercapitalized, the sovereign frequently utilized the Jewish community as a de facto collateral. Royal debts to foreign powers were often secured by pledging future tax revenues from the Jewish quarters. This systemic linkage meant that the community was not merely a source of income, but a strategic tool for the electors' broader imperial and territorial ambitions. The political consequence of this singular dependency was the total absence of a legal appeal process for Jewish subjects. Since the elector was the sole guarantor of their safe conduct, any administrative abuse or arbitrary increase in tallages could not be contested in the common law courts or the imperial chamber court. The community occupied a legal vacuum where the sovereign's will was the only source of legitimacy. This created an environment where the elector could unilaterally declare debt holidays, forcing Jewish creditors to forgive a percentage of noble debts in exchange for the continued right of residence. Such maneuvers allowed the Hohenzollerns to mitigate the social friction between the indebted knights and the crown, effectively using the Jewish financiers as a political buffer to preserve the feudal order. However, the royal favor that shielded the community was intrinsically tied to a cost-benefit analysis of state utility. As the 16th century approached, the Hohenzollern electors began to face increasing pressure from the estates, who offered substantial one-time tax grants in exchange for the reduction of royal prerogatives, including the protection of Jewish financiers. The electorate's fiscal strategy eventually shifted from the continuous extraction of annual interest and protection fees to the prospect of a massive final windfall through total confiscation. Once the political utility of the Jewish middleman was outweighed by the capital gains of their expulsion and the resulting favor of the Christian estates, the royal sword of protection was easily withdrawn. This structural vulnerability meant that the community's total reliance on a single protector was the very mechanism that facilitated its efficient administrative excision. The transition from a valued fiscal asset to a politically expendable target was not a failure of the system, but the logical conclusion of a governance model that viewed the Jewish presence as a captive and ultimately temporary resource of the state. The socio-economic landscape of Brandenburg's urban centers during the late 15th century was increasingly dominated by the rise of corporate bodies known as Zunfte and Gilden, which sought to monopolize specific sectors of production and trade. These Christian guilds operated under the principle of Zunftzwang, a legal requirement that prohibited any individual from practicing a craft or engaging in retail commerce without formal admission into the guild structure. Membership was strictly contingent upon Ehrbarkeit, a concept of civic honor that was inextricably linked to Christian baptism and the adherence to guild-mandated religious observances. Consequently, the Jewish population was legally excluded from the Meisterrecht, the right to achieve master status in the artisanal trades, effectively confining them to a separate economic sphere. However, as the Jewish community diversified its activities from high finance into the wholesale and retail trade of general commodities, they came into direct conflict with the Krämergilden, the powerful guilds of small-scale shopkeepers and peddlers. This economic jealousy was primarily centered on the trade of Schnittwaren, or textiles cut to measure, which was the most profitable segment of the late medieval urban economy. Christian cloth merchants, organized under the Gewandschneider guilds, held exclusive staple rights that required all imported fabrics to be sold through their centralized warehouses. Jewish merchants, utilizing their established international networks, frequently bypassed these municipal staples by conducting Höckerhandel, or unlicensed retail sales, directly from their residential quarters. This competitive pricing, which often undercut the fair price mandated by guild statutes, was viewed by the Christian patriciate as a form of Störerei, the illegal disruption of the managed market. The guilds argued that the Jewish community, by operating outside the burdensome communal duties and guild fees, possessed an unfair operational advantage that threatened the Nahrung, or the guaranteed livelihood, of the Christian burgesses. The political manifestations of this jealousy were channeled through the Rat, the municipal councils of Berlin, Köln, and Spandau. These councils, composed primarily of wealthy guildmasters and merchants, became the principal advocates for restrictive trade ordinances intended to marginalize Jewish commercial activity. Throughout the 1480s and 1490s, the Brandenburg towns petitioned the Hohenzollern electors to impose the Bannmeile, a legal boundary that prohibited Jewish traders from operating within a certain radius of the city walls. They also sought to limit Jewish participation in the weekly markets to specific, low-value goods, attempting to sever their access to the lucrative trade in spices, silks, and dyes. This legislative warfare turned the municipal government into a protective shield for Christian commercial interests, framing the exclusion of Jewish rivals as a necessary measure for the preservation of urban order and the common good of the baptized citizenry. Furthermore, the rise of the Hausgenossen, the lower-tier Christian workers, and unspecialized laborers added a populist dimension to this economic friction. These groups, often struggling with the inflationary pressures of the era, were highly susceptible to the Guild's narrative that Jewish monopolies were responsible for the rising cost of basic commodities. This resentment was codified in the town statutes, which increasingly mandated that Jewish merchants wear specific identifying clothing or badges when entering the public marketplaces, a physical marker that designated them as foreign competitors. By the first decade of the 16th century, the urban environment of the mark had become a zone of intense, institutionalized rivalry. The Christian guilds had successfully transformed their private economic grievances into a public policy of exclusion, creating a consensus among the urban elite that the continued presence of Jewish commercial networks was fundamentally incompatible with the survival of the corporate guild system. The fiscal exigencies of the Hohenzollern electors during the transition into the 16th century became structurally acute, primarily due to the exorbitant costs of imperial diplomacy, the maintenance of the electoral dignity, and the protracted military campaigns regarding the Pomeranian succession. Unlike the territorial estates, who utilized their right of the purse to withhold subsidies in exchange for political concessions, the Jewish community remained a direct and unconditional source of liquid capital for the sovereign's private treasury. The primary mechanism for this extraction was the bead, an arbitrary tallage that functioned as an extraordinary levy imposed during periods of acute state deficit. By the reign of Joachim I Nestor, these financial demands had moved from periodic assessments to a relentless cycle of taxation, designed specifically to satisfy the electors' creditors in the southern German banking centers and to fund the expansion of the central administration. The assessment of the tallage was conducted with increasing administrative rigor, utilizing the detailed inventories of Jewish assets compiled by the electors' Kammerschreiber. The electorate implemented a system of collective liability, where the Jewish elders in Berlin and Spandau were held personally responsible for the delivery of a fixed sum of silver by a non-negotiable deadline. Failure to meet these quotas resulted in the immediate sequestration of communal property or the imprisonment of prominent financiers as human collateral until the debt was satisfied. This fiscal pressure effectively forced the community to liquidate its own operating reserves, undermining the very capital base that sustained the Brandenburg credit market. The tallage functioned as a silent confiscation, allowing the elector to extract wealth without the political friction associated with levying new taxes on the Christian burgesses or the nobility. Furthermore, the Hohenzollerns utilized specialized emergency levies to bridge the gap created by the Landtag's refusal to fund imperial military obligations. When the empire demanded the Gemeiner Pfennig for the defense of the eastern borders, the electors frequently shifted a disproportionate share of this burden onto their Jewish subjects. The community was also subjected to the Sterbefallsteuer, an intensive death duty that required the forfeiture of a significant portion of a financier's estate to the elector's chamber upon his passing. This ensured that the wealth accumulated through generations of professional lending was systematically cycled back into the state coffers, preventing the formation of permanent, independent Jewish capital blocks. The state's fiscal strategy had evolved into a process of capital cannibalization, where the short-term survival of the sovereign's finances was prioritized over the long-term stability of the Jewish economic intermediary. By the first decade of the 1500s, the unrelenting demand for specie had created a state of structural insolvency within the Jewish quarters of the Mark. The community was trapped in a cycle of debt taxation, where they were often forced to borrow from their own international contacts to satisfy the electors' immediate tallage requirements. This intensification of fiscal abuse served a dual political purpose. It provided the elector with the necessary funds to maintain his administrative independence, while simultaneously impoverishing a population that was becoming an increasingly controversial asset. Once the community's ability to provide liquid credit was exhausted by decades of arbitrary tallages, the sovereign's incentive to maintain their legal protection vanished. The tallage was not merely a tax, it was the final stage of an extractive relationship that depleted the community's value to the state, paving the institutional path toward total expulsion as the only remaining means of extracting the residual wealth of the Brandenburg Jews. The formal crystallization of the ritual murder narrative within the Germanic marches provided the indispensable psychological framework for the transition from fiscal exploitation to physical elimination. This specific form of religious hatred, distinct from traditional theological anti-Judaism, posited that the Jewish minority was engaged in a clandestine transnational conspiracy to procure Christian blood for arcane ritualistic purposes. In the decades preceding the 1510 expulsion, these malicious narratives moved from the periphery of folklore into the center of ecclesiastical and secular administration, bolstered by the emerging technology of the printing press. The dissemination of Volksbücher and illustrated broadsides depicted the alleged abduction of Christian children, transforming the Jewish resident from a state-protected financier into a perceived ontological predator. This shift was critical because it recategorized religious nonconformity as a direct physical threat to the biological survival of the Christian community, thereby justifying the suspension of ordinary legal protections. In Brandenburg, the propagation of these myths was often spearheaded by the mendicant orders and the rural clergy, who utilized the pulpit to interpret local disappearances or unsolved deaths as evidence of Jewish malevolence. This rhetoric relied on the blood libel to explain the perceived economic success of the Jewish community, suggesting that their wealth was not the result of professional expertise, but of a demonic compact that demanded the sacrifice of Christian innocence. The theological assertion that Jewish law required Christian blood for the preparation of Passover matzot, or for medical remedies, created a state of perpetual communal anxiety. Unlike earlier centuries where the Margraves might dismiss such claims as populist superstition, the late 15th century administration increasingly recognized the political utility of these accusations. The blood libel served as a convenient extra-legal mechanism, while the servi camerae status protected Jews from commercial lawsuits. It offered no immunity against charges of sacrilege or ritual homicide, which fell under the absolute jurisdiction of the electors' criminal courts. The systematic dissemination of these narratives also involved the exploitation of the Simon of Trent case of 1475, which was widely publicized in the German North as an empirical verification of ritual murder. Brandenburg's intellectuals and judicial officers studied these precedents, incorporating them into a developing legal theory that viewed the Jewish population as inherently reprobus, or reprobate. This conceptual transformation enabled the state to frame the subsequent arrests as an act of defensive purification rather than a violation of established residency charters. The myth of the blood libel successfully bridged the gap between the economic resentment of the urban guilds and the religious fervor of the clergy, creating a unified social front against the Jewish presence. By the first decade of the 16th century, the atmosphere in Berlin and Spandau was saturated with the expectation of a coming unveiling of Jewish crimes. The narrative had reached a state of institutionalized saturation, where any localized incident of theft or violence could be immediately expanded into a general indictment of the entire community. Consequently, the blood libel was not merely a religious error, but a sophisticated tool of social destabilization, providing the moral necessity for the state to dissolve its contract with its Jewish subjects and finalize the process of their administrative excision. The transition from generalized religious prejudice to the specific legal catastrophe of 1510 was precipitated by the formalization of the host desecration charge, a volatile juridical instrument that posited the ritualized mutilation of the consecrated Eucharist by Jewish individuals. The theological foundation for this accusation was rooted in the 1215 decree of the Fourth Lateran Council, which established the doctrine of transubstantiation, asserting that the bread and wine utilized in the Mass became the literal, physical body and blood of Christ. Within this framework, the consecrated host was no longer viewed merely as a symbol, but as a vulnerable, physical manifestation of the divine. The host desecration narrative alleged that Jewish agents sought to acquire these wafers to re-torture the Christian Savior through piercing or burning, an act that supposedly resulted in miraculous bleeding. In the legal climate of the early 16th century Margraviate, such an act was categorized not merely as theft, but as a supreme form of sacrilege and crimen, laesae majestatis divinae, a crime of high treason against the majesty of God. The specific case that triggered the systemic collapse of the Jewish community in Brandenburg originated in February 1510 in the village of Knoblauch. The physical evidence involved the theft of a gilded pyx and 2 consecrated hosts from the local parish church by a Christian laborer and blacksmith named Paul Fromm. Under judicial interrogation and the application of regulated torture, Fromm confessed to selling the sacred elements to a Jewish individual in Spandau. This confession provided the electorate's judicial officers with the necessary empirical verification to bypass the existing royal safe-conducts. Under medieval law, the crime of host desecration superseded all secular residency contracts and commercial privileges, as the defense of the faith and the honor of the Church were paramount. The administrative response was immediate and comprehensive. The elector Joachim Further Nestor utilized this single localized event to launch a coordinated sweep across the entire Margraviate, arresting hundreds of Jewish men and women based on the theory of collective religious conspiracy. The judicial methodology applied to the host desecration charge relied heavily on inquisitorial rather than adversarial procedures. Suspects were interrogated in the Tower of Berlin and the Spandau fortifications, where the objective was to extract a confirmation of the ritual's details, including the alleged bleeding of the host. These confessions, often obtained through the peinliche Befragung, torture aimed at uncovering the truth, were then utilized to construct a narrative of a widespread, clandestine network of sacrilege. The state's focus was to prove that the individual theft was part of a larger communal effort to mock the Christian faith, thereby justifying the total dissolution of the Jewish legal status. This specific charge allowed the electorate to align the interests of the conservative clergy with those of the indebted nobility, as the discovery of such an egregious spiritual crime rendered the Jewish presence morally and legally untenable. Furthermore, the host desecration charge served a vital political function for the Hohenzollern dynasty. By positioning the crown as the primary defender of the Eucharist, Joachim the Emperor Nestor consolidated his authority over the Brandenburg Church and projected an image of uncompromising piety to the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. The public miracles associated with the recovered, allegedly bleeding hosts were utilized to stimulate local pilgrimage and ecclesiastical fervor, effectively transforming a judicial investigation into a religious crusade. The narrative of the desecrated host effectively replaced the community's former identity as camera servi with that of the sacrilegious alien. This conceptual shift finalized the process of social alienation, ensuring that the subsequent mass execution and general expulsion were viewed not as an act of fiscal opportunism, but as a necessary and righteous purification of the Brandenburg realm. Consequently, the host desecration charge was the definitive legal catalyst that transformed a fiscal asset into a capital offense, concluding the era of protected residency and initiating the terminal phase of the 1510 expulsion. The administrative history of the Hohenzollern dynasty in the Margraviate was punctuated by the precedent of 1446, an event that provided the mechanical and legal template for the subsequent total expulsion of 1510. Under the reign of Elector Frederick II, known as Iron Tooth, the state's relationship with its Jewish subjects shifted from one of continuous fiscal extraction to a model of periodic, total liquidation. This earlier crisis was precipitated not by religious mythology or ritual accusations, but by the elector's urgent need to consolidate sovereign authority over the rebellious towns of Berlin and Köln. During the Berliner Unwille, the period of prolonged municipal resistance to Hohenzollern centralization, Frederick II required massive capital reserves to fund his mercenary garrisons and to build the Zwingköln fortress. To secure these funds without the consent of the territorial estates, the electorate executed a coordinated general arrest of all Jewish residents across the Mark on a single day in 1446. The 1446 operation demonstrated the high degree of administrative synchronization available to the Brandenburg Chancellery. Unlike the spontaneous urban riots of the medieval period, this was a state-directed enterprise characterized by the systematic sequestration of all Jewish account books and the physical sealing of residential quarters. The primary objective was the total inventory of outstanding debts owed by the Christian nobility and the urban patriciate to Jewish financiers. Frederick II utilized his sovereign prerogative to declare a general annulment of these debts, effectively transferring the total value of the community's credit portfolio directly to the Crown. This act of fiscal cleansing served a dual political purpose. It provided the elector with an immediate windfall of confiscated bullion while simultaneously purchasing the temporary loyalty of the indebted Christian elite, who were relieved of their significant financial obligations. The legal justification for the 1446 expulsion relied on the accusation of punitive usury and the alleged violation of the electors' earlier residency charters. By framing the community as a collection of economic transgressors, the state was able to bypass the traditional protections afforded to the servi camerae. The community was forced into a brief, localized exile, marking the first time the Hohenzollern state had successfully demonstrated that the right of residency was a transient, revocable privilege rather than a permanent legal status. The subsequent readmission of Jewish families in the late 1440s was not an act of restoration, but a renegotiation of dependency. The new charters issued by the electorate imposed significantly higher protection taxes and more restrictive limits on the geographic movement of Jewish merchants, ensuring that the community remained a highly concentrated and easily accessible fiscal resource. The significance of the 1446 precedent lay in its institutionalization of the crisis liquidation cycle. It proved that the Brandenburg state could effectively resolve its chronic budgetary deficits through the summary expropriation of its Jewish subjects whenever political or military necessity outweighed the value of annual tax revenues. This event eroded the perceived reliability of royal protection and established a psychological environment of perpetual insecurity. The nobility and the town councils learned that the Jewish presence was a flexible political asset that the crown would sacrifice in exchange for domestic tranquility or military funding. By the time Joachim the Firmer Nestor assumed power at the turn of the 16th century, the administrative memory of 1446 provided the blueprint for the terminal crackdown. The earlier expulsion had successfully tested the logistical and legal mechanisms required for a national removal, ensuring that when the host desecration charge provided the necessary moral pretext in 1510, the state was already experienced in the mechanical execution of mass arrest and total asset forfeiture. The accession of Joachim Firmer Nestor in 1499 initiated a transformative era in Brandenburg's constitutional development, characterized by a decisive transition from the fluidities of medieval feudalism to the rigidities of an early modern administrative state. Following the death of his father, Johann Cicero, Joachim assumed the dignity of Prince Elector at the age of 15, initially sharing the regency with his brother Albrecht, before emerging as the singular architect of a centralized sovereign authority. His sobriquet, Nestor, derived from his reputation as a Solomon among the imperial princes, reflected a deliberate political persona centered on the mastery of law and the implementation of rigorous bureaucratic discipline. Unlike his predecessors, who often relied on ad hoc negotiations with the territorial estates, Joachim I envisioned a margraviate governed by the uncompromising principles of Roman law, a legal system that favored the absolute prerogative of the monarch over the traditional customary rights of the nobility and the towns. The central instrument of this administrative rigidity was the reform of the judiciary and the formalization of the Kammergericht, the supreme electoral court, which sought to replace the archaic and decentralized manorial courts with a unified system of professional jurists. This legal centralization was influenced by the establishment of the Reichskammergericht in 1495, reflecting a broader imperial trend toward the professionalization of governance. Joachim's rule was defined by a ruthless suppression of the Federwesen, the culture of private nightly warfare, which he viewed as a systemic impediment to the commercial stability and fiscal integrity of the state. By executing recalcitrant nobles and imposing the public peace with military force, the electors signaled that the internal order of the realm was no longer a matter of feudal consensus, but a mandatory condition of statehood. This drive for institutional uniformity extended to the fiscal domain, where the electorate began to centralize the collection of revenues under a professionalized chancellery in Berlin. Theologically, Joachim Fur Nestor remained a staunch adherent of traditional Catholic orthodoxy, viewing religious dissent as a primary source of social and political destabilization. His desire for strict religious uniformity was not merely a matter of personal piety, but a prerequisite for the internal security of the state, as a singular confessional identity provided the moral cohesion necessary for a centralized monarchy. This ideological framework viewed any non-Christian presence, specifically the Jewish minority, through the lens of administrative and theological irregularity. To Joachim's legalistic mind, the community's exceptional status as servi camerae was an archaic remnant that required final, definitive resolution within the modernizing state. The elector sought to eliminate the legal exceptionalism that had characterized the medieval period, moving toward a society where every subject was integrated into a unified confessional and legal hierarchy. Consequently, the accession of 1499 created the political conditions where the Jewish community was no longer viewed as a valuable, albeit distinct, fiscal asset, but as an administrative anomaly that obstructed the elector's vision of a homogeneous and disciplined Brandenburg. This commitment to state purity and judicial rigidity provided the high-level policy rationale for the subsequent 1510 crackdown, transforming a localized criminal case into a national program of demographic and religious excision. The elector's vision for a clean and orderly state meant that the diversity of the medieval frontier was replaced by the rigid, documented uniformity of an absolute sovereign will. The institutional weight of the Catholic Church within the Margraviate, represented primarily by the bishoprics of Brandenburg, Havelberg, and Lebus, functioned as the secondary pillar of the Hohenzollern state, providing the moral and spiritual legitimacy required for the elector's centralized authority. During the early 16th century, the local ecclesiastical establishment, increasingly influenced by the Observantine reforms within the mendicant orders, initiated a coordinated program of advocacy aimed at the total purification of the Societas Christiana. This clerical lobby posited that the continued presence of a non-baptized minority was not merely a theological irregularity, but a fundamental impediment to the spiritual health and communal salvation of the Brandenburg realm. The clergy's rhetoric shifted from traditional doctrinal refutation to a more aggressive narrative of social contamination, arguing that the elector's protection of Jewish residents was a direct violation of his duty as a Christian prince. Central to this ecclesiastical pressure was the submission of formal gravamina, or grievances, to the elector's court in Berlin, which categorized Jewish commercial and religious activities as a source of spiritual pollution. High-ranking prelates and cathedral chapters argued that the proximity of Jewish quarters to Christian marketplaces fostered a dangerous fluidity that undermined the liturgical boundaries of the Church. They specifically targeted the elector's brother, Albrecht of Brandenburg, who held the bishopric of Magdeburg and would later achieve the primacy of Mainz, to act as an internal advocate for the restrictive policies of the Holy See. This high-level clerical influence ensured that the theological imperatives of the Church were seamlessly integrated into the political deliberations of the Hohenzollern Chancellery. The Church's strategy was to frame the Jewish community as an alien leaven, whose removal was a prerequisite for the terrestrial prosperity of the electorate. The clergy also weaponized the concept of canonical purity, utilizing the decrees of the provincial synods to demand the strict enforcement of the Fourth Lateran Council's segregation mandates. They pressured municipal authorities to restrict Jewish residents from public view during Christian holy days, particularly during the Passion Week, to prevent the mockery of the faith. This systematic marginalization was bolstered by the sermons of the Dominican friars who conducted public missions in the Brandenburg towns, aimed at inciting populist religious fervor. These preachers articulated a vision of a sacred geography where the soil of the mark was to be uniquely consecrated to the Eastern Rite, leaving no space for the practitioners of the Old Law. By portraying the Jewish financier as a spiritual rival to the parish priest, the clergy successfully eroded the social consensus that had previously permitted the community's residents under the elector's fiscal protection. Furthermore, the ecclesiastical establishment utilized its control over the education of the Brandenburg elite to instill a rigorous exclusionary orthodoxy within the next generation of civil servants. The University of Frankfurt an der Oder, while briefly a center for Hebrew studies, became a primary site for the development of polemical theology that viewed the expulsion of non-Christians as an act of godly justice. This ideological environment ensured that when the host desecration charge emerged in 1510, it was received by a court already sensitized to the clergy's demands for total religious homogeneity. The Church provided the sovereign with the moral mandate to dissolve his contractual obligations to the Servi Camerae, framing the subsequent trials and executions as a necessary liturgical act of atonement for the sins of the realm. Consequently, the pressure of the clergy was the decisive factor that transformed the elector's administrative rigidity into a program of active persecution, ensuring that the 1510 expulsion was viewed as the ultimate triumph of the Christian faith over the historical diversity of the Brandenburg frontier. The political friction between the Hohenzollern centralism and the Ritterschaft, or the knightly estate, reached a critical threshold in the first decade of the 16th century, as the Brandenburg nobility sought to convert their private economic distress into a constitutional challenge. While previous decades were defined by the transactional utility of Jewish credit, the compounding nature of ancestral debt had transformed the Verschreibung, the pledging of manorial revenues, into a systemic threat to noble lineage and territorial integrity. The Brandenburg aristocracy increasingly viewed the Jewish financier not merely as a creditor, but as the structural instrument that enabled the elector's fiscal independence. By providing Joachim Furrer Nestor with a continuous stream of liquid capital through tallages and loans, the Jewish community allowed the crown to bypass the Landtag, the territorial diet, where the nobility traditionally exercised their right to consent to taxation. Consequently, the noble grievance was twofold: a desperate need for debt liquidation and a strategic desire to dismantle the elector's primary source of non-parliamentary revenue. This mobilization was formalized through the Ständische Verfassung, the provincial constitutional framework that governed the relationship between the sovereign and the estates. During the sessions of the Landtag in Berlin and Frankfurt, the knightly estate coordinated with the prelacy and the municipal representatives to present a unified front against the elector's fiscal agents. The nobility argued that the elector's protection of usurers was a fundamental breach of his landesväterliche Pflicht, or paternal duty, to safeguard the economic viability of the feudal order. They utilized the growing influence of the Reichskammergericht, the imperial chamber court, to challenge the legality of high-interest contracts, seeking to reclassify these professional loans as predatory and thus void under the expanding influence of Roman law. By framing their private insolvency as a public injustice, the nobility effectively shifted the blame for the Margraviate's economic stagnation from their own mismanagement of manorial estates to the presence of the Jewish intermediaries. Furthermore, the nobility recognized that the expulsion of the Jewish community offered a definitive solution to the problem of alienation of land. Under the existing system, many noble families were forced to surrender the usufruct of their villages to Jewish creditors to satisfy interest payments, a condition that undermined their judicial authority over the peasantry. The Ritterschaft lobbied for a Schuldentilgung, a general debt amnesty, which they made a non-negotiable condition for the granting of extraordinary subsidies required for the elector's military ventures. This was a sophisticated display of political leverage. The nobility offered the crown the taxes it required to maintain its imperial standing only if the crown agreed to sacrifice its Jewish fiscal buffer. The demand for expulsion was thus a calculated move to starve the elector's central administration of independent capital, forcing Joachim I to rely solely on the tax grants approved by the noble-dominated Landtag. The ideological justification for this noble push was reinforced by the concept of Ehre, or noble honor, which was presented as being incompatible with the subservience to Jewish financial dictates. The aristocracy argued that the Margraviate should be governed by a Landrecht that prioritized the preservation of ancestral holdings over the mercantile interests of the urban quarters. By 1509, this political alliance between the indebted knights and the exclusionary clergy had created an insurmountable pressure on the Berlin court. The nobility made it clear that their continued support for the Hohenzollern dynasty was contingent upon a cleansing of the credit market. This convergence of financial desperation and constitutional ambition meant that the 1510 expulsion was not a spontaneous religious event, but the fulfillment of a long-standing noble program to reassert feudal dominance over the state's fiscal machinery, ensuring that the elector's absolute power was effectively curtailed by the removal of his most reliable financial agents. The transition of royal policy within the Margraviate signaled the definitive end of the utilitarian phase of Jewish presence, as the chancellery in Berlin began to reconfigure its legal apparatus to prioritize the criminalization of its Jewish subjects. Joachim Bern Nestor, leveraging his mastery of Roman jurisprudence, initiated a process where the traditional protective charters were systematically reframed as conditional licenses that could be retroactively nullified by the commission of a capital religious crime. This administrative pivot was facilitated by the professionalization of the Kammergericht, which shifted its focus from the adjudication of commercial disputes to the prosecution of crimen exceptum, crimes so heinous that they justified the suspension of standard procedural safeguards. The judicial trap was constructed by establishing a legal hierarchy where the defense of the Eucharist and the spiritual health of the Christian state superseded any historical fiscal utility the Jewish community provided to the sovereign. The electorate's legal theorists argued that the status of servi camerae conferred a duty of total submission to the sovereign's moral and religious directives, thereby making any alleged act of sacrilege a direct breach of the vassal-like bond between the Jew and the chamber. This conceptual evolution allowed the state to treat the localized incident of host theft not as a common larceny, but as a coordinated assault upon the spiritual foundations of the Hohenzollern dynasty. By criminalizing the entire community through the theory of collective religious conspiracy, the state provided itself with the necessary justification to freeze all Jewish assets and halt the repayment of noble debts. The judicial trap ensured that the wealth previously protected by the elector's peace was now legally categorized as the proceeds of an inherently criminal population, rendering it subject to immediate and total forfeiture. Furthermore, the court implemented a summary judicial process that prioritized rapid conviction over evidentiary rigor. The use of the Carolina, the nascent imperial criminal code, allowed for the application of extraordinary interrogation methods to uncover the alleged network of sacrilege. This was a strategic departure from the previous century's policy of protecting the Jewish intermediary to ensure the flow of capital. The state now calculated that the political and fiscal gains of a definitive criminal liquidation far outweighed the annual revenues of the Schutzgeld. The Chancellery utilized the criminal proceedings to produce a verifiable record of Jewish malevolence, which served to validate the elector's decision to the imperial diet and the Holy See. This transformation of policy turned the legal system into a mechanism of expropriation, where the death of the subject and the seizure of their ledgers were the primary objectives of the state. The final stage of this criminalization involved the formal declaration that the Jewish presence was a public nuisance that threatened the internal stability of the mark. By utilizing the judiciary to prove that Jewish life was intrinsically linked to sacrilegious rituals, Joachim Bern Nestor effectively ended the community's legal existence before the first sentence was even carried out. The transition was complete. The Jewish subjects were no longer productive assets to be nurtured, but criminal liabilities to be excised through the blunt force of the elector's supreme judicial authority. This systemic weaponization of the law ensured that the 1510 expulsion was not an arbitrary act of violence, but a meticulously documented judicial operation that finalized the Hohenzollern state's mastery over its demographic and fiscal landscape. The specific historical catalyst that collapsed the legal protections of the Brandenburg Jury, originated in the village of Knoblauch in early 1510, following the apprehension of a Christian blacksmith named Paul Fromm. This individual was detained by local authorities after the discovery of a sacrilegious larceny at the village parish church, an act that involved the forced entry into the tabernacle. The stolen items consisted of a gilded copper pyx and 2 consecrated hosts, objects which, under the prevailing doctrine of transubstantiation, represented the supreme liturgical value of the Roman rite. During the initial summary proceedings, Fromm provided a deposition that diverted the criminal focus from a simple case of theft to a broader communal religious indictment. He asserted that his primary motivation for the robbery was the existence of a prior commercial agreement with a Jewish resident of Spandau, who had allegedly offered a specific sum of silver groschen in exchange for the sacred elements. This testimony transformed a localized criminal incident into a statewide judicial emergency, providing the Hohenzollern Chancellery with the specific corpus delicti required to initiate a general crackdown. Fromm claimed to have traveled to the strategic administrative center of Spandau to complete the transaction with a financier named Salomon, further alleging that the Jewish purchaser intended to distribute the wafers among the various kehilot of the mark for ritual desecration. The Spandau magistrate, acting upon direct orders from the elector's central administration, immediately executed the arrest of Salomon and several associated family members, initiating a series of confrontational interrogations intended to confirm the smith's narrative. The speed of this administrative response indicated that the state was prepared to prioritize the smith's testimony as a verifiable fact, despite the inherent unreliability of a confessed thief facing capital punishment. The escalation of the Spandau accusation was facilitated by the immediate involvement of the elector's judicial commission, which moved the proceedings from the municipal level to the direct jurisdiction of the sovereign. The state's focus during the Spandau phase was the recovery of the bleeding hosts, a pursuit that aimed to provide empirical evidence of the alleged miracle to the public. While the gilded pyx was recovered from Fromm's possession, the fate of the wafers remained a matter of judicial reconstruction based on confessions extracted under the peinliche Befragung. The Spandau accusation effectively acted as a bridge between the theoretical hostility of the Brandenburg clergy and the practical fiscal ambitions of the crown, as it furnished a specific name and location to the generalized myths of Jewish sacrilege. It provided the necessary legal pretext to suspend the residency charters of the entire community, as the charge of receiving and trafficking stolen sacred property was categorized as a non-pardonable offense. By late February 1510, the Fromm case had been successfully expanded into a comprehensive investigation into the clandestine activities of the Jewish quarters across the Margraviate. The Spandau arrests served as the signal for a coordinated national sweep, as the Chancellery utilized Fromm's evolving testimony to implicate prominent financiers in Berlin, Brandenburg, and Frankfurt. The smith's claim that he had been solicited by the Jewish community turned the individual act of theft into a state-sanctioned narrative of a Jewish conspiracy against the Christian order. This localized spark was the definitive event that allowed Joachim Pomern Nestor to move from the abstract judicial trap to the physical mobilization of his judicial and military forces. The Spandau accusation thereby terminated the era of commercial utility and initiated the terminal phase of mass incarceration, ensuring that the 1510 expulsion began with a documented, if legally dubious, criminal act that satisfied the procedural requirements of the early modern state. The logistical execution of the mass arrests in 1510 represented the zenith of Hohenzollern administrative coordination, shifting the state-sanctioned persecution from a localized Spandau inquiry into a comprehensive territorial sweep. Following the expansion of Paul Fromm's testimony, the electoral chancellery dispatched a series of sealed mandates to the bailiffs and magistrates of every town harboring a Jewish community, including Frankfurt and Der Oder, Brandenburg and Der Havel, and Stendal. These orders stipulated a simultaneous strike, a synchronization intended to prevent the flight of capital or the concealment of evidence across the regional borders of the Mark. On a designated day in the early spring of 1510, the Landreiter, the electors' mounted marshals, and local municipal guards occupied the entry points of the various Jewish quarters, initiating a systemic incarceration of all individuals regardless of their age or economic status. This operation effectively transformed the previously protected Jewish streets into zones of military occupation, marking the definitive suspension of the residency charters that had governed the community for centuries. The incarceration phase involved the transport of hundreds of detainees to the central administrative fortifications of the realm, primarily the high-security dungeons of the Berlin Palace and the tower facilities in Spandau. Unlike ordinary criminal suspects, these prisoners were categorized as state heretics, a designation that permitted the use of intensive sensory deprivation and isolation to facilitate the judicial inquiry. While the physical persons were secured, a separate bureaucratic commission, led by the Kammerschreiber, commenced the rigorous sequestration of Jewish property. This was not a chaotic pillage, but a meticulously documented liquidation process. The officials applied royal seals to the doors of the stone-built houses and immediately sequestered all official chests, which contained the bipartite indentures and loan bonds that formed the bedrock of the Brandenburg credit market. The primary objective of the sequestration was the total acquisition of the Jewish ledgers, the comprehensive records of Christian indebtedness, which allowed the electorate to identify and control every outstanding obligation in the realm. The inventorying of assets extended beyond liquid capital to include the precious metal collateral and religious artifacts held within the synagogues and private vaults. Scribes produced detailed cadaster lists of silver plate, jewels, and luxury textiles, which were immediately transferred to the elector's treasury as the spoils of sacrilege. This process of sequestration effectively achieved the state's goal of fiscal mapping, providing Joachim the Firmer's Nestor with a complete, verifiable inventory of the community's residual wealth. The immediate result of these mass arrests was a systemic paralysis of the urban economy. With the primary financiers imprisoned and their account books seized, the flow of credit ceased entirely, and the debt bonds were effectively frozen under royal custody. The state utilized this interval to audit the seized documents, preparing for a general debt adjustment that would satisfy the knightly estate. By the time the formal trials commenced, the Jewish community had been stripped of both its physical freedom and its financial infrastructure, ensuring that their legal defense was non-existent. The mass arrests and sequestration thus functioned as the terminal administrative act of the Brandenburg state, converting a specialized population into a captive inventory of confiscated wealth and securing the sovereign's absolute control over the fiscal future of the Margraviate. The judicial proceedings initiated in Berlin during the summer of 1510 represented a systemic suspension of the traditional Landrecht, or common law, which had historically governed the legal interactions between the Brandenburg sovereign and his subjects. As the Electors' Commission shifted its focus from the investigation of a local theft to the prosecution of a communal sacrilege, the trial transitioned into a state of extraordinary jurisdiction. Under the emerging influence of the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, crimes categorized as crimen exceptum, such as host desecration and ritual murder, permitted the judiciary to bypass the standard evidentiary requirements that protected the accused in civil or commercial litigation. The fundamental principle of habeas corpus and the specific protections afforded by the earlier residency charters were rendered null, as the state argued that the nature of the spiritual crime constituted a total breach of the social contract. This breakdown of common law transformed the courtroom into a mechanism for the verification of a predetermined state narrative, rather than a forum for impartial adjudication. The methodology of the Berlin trial was defined by the transition from an adversarial system to an inquisitorial one, where the judges acted as both the prosecutors and the ultimate arbiters of fact. The primary objective of the Electors' Commission was to obtain a formal confession, which, according to the legal theory of the time, was the regina probationum, or the queen of evidence. To achieve this, the state utilized the peinliche Befragung, a regulated system of judicial torture, which was applied with increasing intensity to the primary defendants held in the Berlin Palace and the town's defensive towers. The interrogation protocols were designed to extract not just an admission of guilt, but a confirmation of the specific ritual details of the host desecration myth, including the alleged use of needles to pierce the wafers and the resulting miraculous bleeding. These forced confessions were systematically cross-referenced to implicate the widest possible network of Jewish families, ensuring that the legal outcome would support a general expulsion. Crucially, the defendants were denied the right to Rechtsbeistand, or legal counsel, a deprivation that ensured they could not challenge the technical validity of Paul Fromm's conflicting testimonies. The Judicial Commission also disregarded the traditional Jewish right to be tried by their own peers or to provide witnesses from their own community, a standard privilege that had been part of the Hohenzollern legal framework for generations. Instead, the court relied exclusively on circumstantial evidence and the coerced statements of the Spandau detainees, which were presented as empirical truth. The procedural irregularities were further compounded by the use of leading questions and the deliberate isolation of the prisoners, which prevented any coordinated defense or the exposure of the contradictions within the state's case. This tactical suppression of legal rights turned the judicial process into a closed administrative loop where the electors' political and religious objectives dictated the procedural flow. The summary nature of the justice was also reflected in the speed with which the final verdicts were prepared. The court did not seek to investigate the material impossibility of the alleged rituals or the lack of physical evidence regarding the bleeding hosts. Rather, it focused on the theological necessity of a conviction to restore the honor of the Church. By July 1510, the judicial trap had successfully converted the complex legal history of the Brandenburg jury into a simplified criminal dossier. The breakdown of common law allowed Joachim I Nestor to project an image of a disciplined, absolute monarch who placed the defense of the faith above the archaic legalism of the medieval period. This institutionalized disregard for established legal protections ensured that the final sentences would be viewed as a definitive, unassailable act of state, leaving no room for appeal or imperial intervention. The culmination of the 1510 judicial proceedings occurred on July 19, 1510, at the Neuer Markt in Berlin, a central public square situated near St. Mary's Church. This site was selected by the electoral administration to maximize the visibility of the execution, transforming a terminal criminal sentence into a choreographed manifestation of state and ecclesiastical authority. The execution of 38 Jewish men who had been convicted of host desecration and ritual sacrilege was conducted through the method of Verbrennen am Pfahl, or burning at the stake. This specific form of capital punishment was mandated by the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina for crimes of heresy and sacrilege, as the use of fire was theologically intended to symbolize the purification of the realm and the total destruction of the physical vessel of the infidel. The mechanical arrangement of the execution site involved the construction of a massive wooden platform designed to accommodate multiple stakes simultaneously, reflecting the scale of the state's coordinated crackdown. The presence of Elector Joachim I Nestor and his entire court underscored the political significance of the event. The execution was not merely a judicial conclusion, but a performative act of Majestätssymbolic, the symbolism of majesty, intended to demonstrate that the Hohenzollern dynasty was the primary defender of the Christian faith in the northeastern empire. The elector, accompanied by high-ranking prelates and the masters of the Brandenburg guilds, utilized the spectacle to reaffirm the Landfrieden, or public peace, by showing that no group, regardless of their historical royal protection, was immune to the sovereign's religious and judicial standards. This event functioned as a public Te Deum, an act of state-sponsored liturgy that sought to restore the spiritual equilibrium of the mark, following the alleged desecration of the Eucharist. The execution of Paul Fromm, the Christian smith, occurred alongside the Jewish defendants, though he was subjected to the even more grueling punishment of being broken on the wheel before being burned, a distinction that emphasized the state's intent to punish both the thief and the alleged purchasers of the sacred elements. A critical historical detail of the execution was the refusal of the 38 victims to accept baptism in exchange for a merciful death by the sword. Under the legal customs of the period, a deathbed conversion would have permitted a more rapid execution, sparing the victim the prolonged agony of the pyre. The collective refusal of the defendants signaled a final act of communal resistance against the elector's program of religious uniformity, transforming the execution into a testament to the theological durability of the Jewish community, even in the face of total state coercion. The physical disposal of the remains followed the strict requirements for sacrilege, The ashes of the executed were scattered to prevent the creation of any site of pilgrimage or memorial, effectively erasing the physical memory of the individuals from the Brandenburg soil. This damnatio memoriae was a deliberate administrative strategy intended to signal that the Jewish presence had been totally and irrevocably purged from the life of the capital. The socio-political impact of the execution was immediate and profound. The spectacle at the Neuer Markt served as a definitive warning to the remaining Jewish families in the provinces that the era of royal favor had been replaced by a regime of uncompromising orthodoxy. For the urban populace and the indebted nobility, the sight of the financiers at the stake provided a visceral confirmation that their financial obligations were being liquidated through the ultimate power of the elector's sword. The 1510 execution thus stood as the definitive marker of the new Brandenburg statecraft, a system where administrative rigidity, religious homogeneity, and the absolute power of the monarch were unified in a single public act of justification. By sunset on July 19th, the Jewish intellectual and financial elite of Berlin had been physically annihilated, leaving the remaining community in a state of total legal and social paralysis, awaiting the formal decree of their final departure. The formalization of the expulsion began with the issuance of the General Ausweisung, the general mandate of banishment, in late July 1510, immediately following the conclusion of the Berlin trials. This administrative document functioned as the definitive legal instrument that terminated the centuries-long history of Jewish residency within the Margraviate of Brandenburg. Unlike the previous localized restrictions or the temporary exile of 1446, the 1510 decree was framed as a perpetual and irreversible act of state. The elector, Joachim I Nestor, utilizing his absolute prerogative as prince-elector, declared that the Camerae Servi status was formally dissolved and that any existing Schutzbrief or Geleitbrief were retroactively nullified. The mandate established a rigid Stichtag, or terminal deadline, typically set for the autumn period around the feast of St. Gall, by which time every individual of Jewish faith was required to have physically crossed the borders of the Mark. This administrative deadline allowed the state a narrow window to finalize the liquidation of communal assets while ensuring that the purification of the land was achieved before the winter season. The geographic scope of the decree was comprehensive, encompassing the Altmark, Mittelmark, Neumark, and the Prignitz, ensuring that no pocket of Jewish residency remained within the Hohenzollern territories. The Chancellery dispatched copies of the mandate to every Amtmann, district governor, and town council, with instructions for it to be read aloud in the market squares to ensure total public awareness. The legal language of the decree emphasized that any Jewish individual found within the borders of Brandenburg after the Stichtag would be subject to immediate corporal punishment or execution, a threat intended to prevent the lingering of the impoverished or the elderly. This mandate also included a specific Ewigkeitsklausel, or eternity clause, which prohibited any future elector from readmitting Jewish subjects without a fundamental revision of the state's constitutional and religious foundations. By codifying the expulsion in this manner, Joachim I Nestor sought to bind his successors to a policy of confessional homogeneity, effectively removing the Jewish presence from the political possibilities of the Brandenburg state for the foreseeable future. Administratively, the decree functioned as a final audit of departure, requiring every Jewish family to appear before the local bailiffs to surrender any remaining debt instruments or property deeds that had not already been seized during the initial arrests. The state utilized this process to ensure that no private credit lines remained that could potentially bypass the Crown's new fiscal monopoly. The mandate also formalized the prohibition on the export of good silver and gold coinage, requiring the exiles to convert their remaining liquid assets into the debased currencies of neighboring territories, a move that further maximized the electors' bullion reserves. This fiscal oversight ensured that the expulsion was not a chaotic flight, but a controlled administrative extraction, where the state monitored the departure to ensure that no significant capital escaped its jurisdiction. The decree of 1510 also served as a diplomatic signal to the other princes of the Holy Roman Empire and the Papal See, positioning Brandenburg as a leader in the movement toward a unified Christian society. The electorate presented the mandate as a necessary response to the unveiled crimes of sacrilege, framing the administrative excision as an act of piety that restored the spiritual integrity of the northeastern marches. By the time the final copies of the edict were filed in the state archives, the Jewish community had been legally transformed into a forbidden class, whose very existence within the mark was now a capital offense. The issuance of the decree thus marked the completion of the transition from a society of medieval diversity to an early modern state defined by the rigid, documented uniformity of the sovereign's will. This document was the terminal point of the 1510 crisis, providing the legal finality that enabled the state to begin the physical repurposing of the Jewish quarters and the permanent absorption of their former wealth. Following the promulgation of the General Ausweisung, the administrative focus of the Brandenburg Chancellery shifted from the removal of persons to the permanent expropriation of immovable property. This systematic seizure, known as the forfeiture of the deeds, represented the final phase of the state's transition from a protector of Jewish assets to their ultimate beneficiary. Under the legal theory of fiscus, the elector claimed that because the community had been convicted of capital sacrilege, their entire landed estate was legally eschated to the crown. This process was not a disorganized confiscation, but a meticulously audited transfer of titles, managed by the elector's bailiffs and the scribes of the Kammergericht. Every stone house, communal building, and plot of consecrated land was inventoried and formally struck from the Jewish registers, then re-entered into the elector's land cadaster as royal domain. The primary targets of this forfeiture were the Domus Lapidae, the high-value stone houses that formed the architectural core of the Jewish quarters in Berlin and Spandau. These structures, previously utilized as secure vaults for bullion and ledgers, were immediately repurposed as state assets. Joachim Berfer, Nestor, utilized these buildings as political currency, re-granting the titles to loyal members of the Christian patriciate, university professors, and high-ranking civil servants who had facilitated the 1510 proceedings. This redistribution served a dual function. It satisfied the spatial demands of the burgeoning Brandenburg bureaucracy and physically rewarded the administrative elite without depleting the sovereign's cash reserves. By transferring these deeds to Christian owners, the state effectively erased the physical foothold of the Jewish community, ensuring that their former residences were integrated into the municipal fabric of the Christian towns. The forfeiture of communal religious infrastructure, the synagogues and ritual baths, was conducted with a specific intent of desacralization, while the liquid contents of the schola had been seized during the initial arrests. The physical shells of the buildings were now formally converted. In many instances, the electorate authorized the transformation of synagogues into storage facilities for the state's grain monopolies or into secular administrative offices. This repurposed usage was a calculated act of administrative erasure, intended to prove that the infrastructure of faith was no longer a protected sanctuary, but a common commodity under the sovereign's control. The ritual baths, requiring sophisticated hydraulic systems, were often decommissioned or adapted for municipal industrial use, further stripping the urban environment of the technical markers of Jewish life. The most permanent act of forfeiture concerned the Beth Olam, the Jewish cemeteries situated on the urban peripheries. Unlike residential properties, which retained their utility, the cemeteries were subjected to a process of legal profanation. The Crown asserted its right over these lands as wasteland, allowing for the removal of headstones to be utilized as raw building material for the fortification of the Berlin Palace and the repair of municipal walls. This systematic destruction of the ancestral burial grounds was intended to sever the community's historical and spiritual continuity with the mark. By the autumn of 1510, the forfeiture of the deeds was complete. The Hohenzollern state had successfully absorbed the total fixed capital of its former Jewish subjects, leaving no physical or legal trace of their centuries-long habitation within the urban landscape of Brandenburg. This total expropriation finalized the economic excision, ensuring that even if the people departed, their accumulated architectural and territorial wealth remained a permanent asset of the Brandenburg Crown. The 3-month countdown initiated by the General Ausweisung was a period of intense administrative surveillance and economic desperation, defined by the rigid Stichtag of October 16, 1510. This deadline, coinciding with the feast of St. Gall, served as the terminal point for all Jewish presence within the Margraviate, leaving a narrow 90-day window for the remaining families to liquidate their movable estates. Unlike the previous sequestration of stone houses and communal buildings, this phase focused on the disposal of personal effects, household goods, and residual commercial inventories that the state had not already inventoried for the Crown. The electorate's chancellery mandated that these sales be conducted under the supervision of municipal bailiffs to ensure that no illicit transfers of wealth occurred between Jewish families. This oversight effectively turned every transaction into a public record, as the state sought to prevent the concealment of assets through private trust arrangements. The economic reality of the countdown was characterized by the Notverkauf, or emergency fire sale, where the departing population was forced to sell their remaining possessions to a Christian populace that was fully aware of the non-negotiable nature of the departure date. Because the decree forbade the export of high-grade silver and gold bullion, the exiles were compelled to convert their physical belongings into portable goods or the debased copper currencies of neighboring principalities. This created a profound market imbalance. Christian burgesses and artisans often waited until the final weeks of the countdown to offer derisory prices for high-quality furniture, textiles, and domestic tools, knowing that any unsold items would be forfeited to the electorate upon the deadline. The administrative rigidity of the countdown thus functioned as a secondary form of expropriation, as the value of the community's movable wealth was systematically eroded by the artificial pressure of the ticking clock. Logistically, the countdown was enforced by the Amtmänner, the district governors, who conducted weekly censuses to track the preparation of each household. Any attempt to seek a Gnadenfrist, or a temporary extension of stay for the elderly, the infirm, or women in late-term pregnancy, was summarily rejected by the Berlin Chancellery. Joachim vom Nestor viewed any deviation from the October deadline as an act of civil disobedience and a threat to the purification of the realm. This refusal to grant medical or humanitarian exemptions meant that the community had to organize the transport of their most vulnerable members using rudimentary carts and wagons, often purchased at inflated prices from the very merchants who had replaced them in the local markets. The state also utilized this period to settle any remaining petty debts. However, the Judicial Commission ensured that Christian claims against Jewish exiles were satisfied in full, while Jewish claims against Christians were frequently dismissed as unverifiable due to the prior seizure of the account books. As the Stichtag approached, the Jewish quarters became zones of frantic activity where the physical markers of centuries of habitation were dismantled. The community was required to surrender the keys to their sealed homes to the municipal magistrates, who performed final inspections to ensure that no structural damage had been done to the properties now belonging to the Crown. This period of administrative transition effectively stripped the Jewish residents of their remaining dignity, as they were legally classified as transients in the very homes they had built. By early October, the road wardens and border marshals were placed on high alert to process the exodus, ensuring that the flow of refugees toward the Polish and Bohemian frontiers was unidirectional and permanent. The 3-month countdown was therefore not merely a logistical interval, but a calculated administrative tool designed to maximize the state's fiscal gain while ensuring the total and orderly removal of a demographic class that had been rendered legally non-existent. The terminal phase of the 1510 expulsion was defined by a systematic devaluation of Jewish movable wealth, mandated by a specific monetary ordinance that categorized the removal of gold and silver as an act of fiscal treason against the mark. While previous administrative acts had already secured the community's landed property for the Crown, the focus now shifted to the mobilia, the personal effects, commercial, stocks, and household inventories that remained in Jewish possession. Joachim vom Nestor implemented a rigorous bullion embargo prohibiting the export of any high-grade specie, including the Rhenish florin and the Brandenburg groschen. This policy was intended to ensure that the good silver of the realm remained within the elector's treasury, effectively forcing the departing families to abandon their most concentrated forms of capital. The exiles were required to undergo a final Münzprüfung, or currency audit, where any discovered bullion was subject to immediate confiscation without compensation. This legal restriction triggered a localized economic phenomenon known as the Notverkauf, a cycle of distress sales where The value of Jewish personal property was dictated by the predatory leverage of the Christian burgesses. Because the October 16th deadline was non-negotiable, the Christian populace engaged in a strategy of deferred purchasing, waiting until the final days of the countdown to offer prices that represented a mere fraction of the asset's intrinsic worth. Valuable commodities such as imported silks, scientific instruments, and specialized tools were liquidated at derisory rates, as the Jewish owners were legally unable to transport bulky items and forbidden from carrying their value in coin. The state-mandated deadline turned the open market into a mechanism of wealth transfer, where the desperate need for portability allowed the urban Christian elite to acquire high-quality goods for nominal sums. The conversion of wealth was further complicated by the mandatory use of debased currency for the journey into exile. The Brandenburg Chancellery required that any remaining liquid capital be exchanged for Landmünze, low-denomination copper coins, and debased silver pieces that were not accepted for major international transactions. This Zwangsumtausch, or forced exchange, allowed the elector to absorb the community's last reserves of high-purity silver while providing the exiles with a currency that lost significant purchasing power the moment they crossed the frontier. The physical logistics of this exchange were inherently disadvantageous. The exiles were forced to carry heavy bags of base metal coinage, which made them visible targets for highway robbery and increased the cost of transport, as more wagons were required to move the less valuable, bulkier currency. Furthermore, the state implemented a Zoll visitation at the border checkpoints, where every wagon and personal bundle was subjected to a final, invasive inspection by the electors' marshals. These officials were authorized to seize any item of material significance to the state, including Hebrew manuscripts and archival documents, under the pretext that they contained records of the sacrilegious community. The liquidated assets of the Brandenburg Jewry thus provided a final, intensive stimulus to the local Christian economy, as the community's wealth was redistributed through forced sales and state-mandated exchange. By the time the final convoys reached the border, the formerly affluent financier class had been reduced to a state of near penury, their centuries of accumulated capital having been systematically siphoned off through the combined pressure of the bullion ban and the artificial market of the Notverkauf. This economic destruction was the penultimate stage of the expulsion, ensuring that the exiles carried with them only the barest means of physical survival. The exodus from the Margraviate in the autumn of 1510 was a coordinated movement of the remaining Jewish families toward the territories of the Polish crown and the lands of the Bohemian crown. This migration followed the primary transit corridors of the Holy Roman Empire, with refugees utilizing the trade routes that connected the Spree-Havel basin to the Vistula and the Moldau. The transition across the Brandenburg frontier represented more than a geographic shift. It was a movement from a state of total criminalization to jurisdictions that still maintained a pluralistic legal framework for non-Christian subjects. The primary attractant in the east was the Kingdom of Poland, which under the Jagiellonian dynasty offered a stable legal foundation based on the Statute of Cales. This 13th century charter, reaffirmed by King Sigismund I, granted the Jewish community significant internal autonomy, including the right to be judged by their own elders in civil matters, and a guarantee of personal safety under the direct protection of the Polish monarch. The logistics of the trek were governed by the Geleitrecht of the transit territories, such as the Duchy of Silesia and the Lusatian Marches. Because the exiles had been stripped of their high-grade bullion, they were forced to pay the Leibzoll, or body tax, at every provincial border using the debased copper coinage acquired during the liquidation phase. The movement was organized by the remnants of the municipal Kahilot, which attempted to preserve a degree of social cohesion during the transit to prevent the total atomization of the community. In the Kingdom of Poland, the refugees encountered the Kahal system, a sophisticated form of communal self-governance that was far more robust than the decentralized structures they had left in Brandenburg. This administrative model allowed the Polish crown to collect taxes efficiently through a central Jewish council, while granting the community the right to manage their own religious and educational institutions without direct interference from the state. Bohemia served as a secondary destination, particularly the city of Prague, which was emerging as a major center of Hebrew printing and rabbinic scholarship. Under the reign of Vladislaus II, the Bohemian estates maintained a pragmatic policy toward Jewish financiers, viewing them as a necessary counterweight to the power of the urban guilds. The Maas, refugees arriving in Prague, were integrated into the Judenstadt, an autonomous district that operated under its own municipal administration. This Bohemian jurisdiction provided a temporary sanctuary for the intellectuals and artisans expelled from Berlin, allowing for the preservation of the Masoretic and Halachic traditions that had been under threat during the 1510 trials. The pluralism of these eastern lands was rooted in a different concept of statehood than the rigid uniformity sought by Joachim I Nestor. The Polish and Bohemian sovereigns viewed the Jewish presence as a functional component of their diverse, multi-ethnic realms. The trek also resulted in a significant demographic shift in the Jewish Pale of settlement, as the influx of refugees from the German north contributed to the growth of towns like Poznan, Kalisz, and Krakow. These exiles brought with them the Ashkenazic liturgical traditions and the Yiddish language, which would eventually become the dominant cultural markers of the Jewish communities in the East. The road to Poland was therefore a movement toward a protected autonomy that contrasted sharply with the captive dependence of the Brandenburg period. By the time the final groups of refugees reached the eastern border stations, the transition was complete. The exiles had moved from a jurisdiction of administrative rigidity and capital forfeiture to a region where their commercial and intellectual capital could once again be deployed within a framework of documented corporate rights. The 1510 expulsion thus facilitated the eastward expansion of the Ashkenazic world, ensuring that the legacy of the Brandenburg Jewry was preserved within the more tolerant structures of the Polish-Lithuanian and Bohemian legal systems. The physical vacancy of the Jewish quarters following the October 1510 deadline initiated an intensive period of urban reconsecration and administrative restructuring designed to integrate the sequestered districts into the unified Christian topography of the Mark. The primary objective of the Brandenburg Chancellery was the total erasure of the exceptional status of these areas, transitioning them from private enclaves under royal protection to common municipal property under the jurisdiction of the city councils and the local parishes. This process began with the mandatory renaming of the Judenstrasse and Judengasse in Berlin, Spandau, and Frankfurt an der Oder. By replacing these ethnic toponyms with names honoring Christian saints, ecclesiastical offices, or local guilds such as Bischofstrasse or Klosterstrasse, the state effectively removed the Jewish presence from the mental and linguistic map of the citizenry, ensuring that the geographic memory of the community was suppressed in all future municipal records. Architecturally, the conversion involved the removal of the physical boundaries that had historically defined the Jewish settlements. The gates and barriers that facilitated the eruv and the nighttime curfews were demolished, allowing for the integration of the former quarters into the broader urban street plans favored by the electors' surveyors. This structural opening was accompanied by the transformation of the Schola sites into institutions of Christian charity and municipal oversight. In several instances, the electorate authorized the conversion of former synagogues into Heilig Geist Hospitaler, hospitals of the Holy Spirit, or almshouses for the Christian poor. This repurposing served a vital ideological function. It demonstrated that the wealth and space once occupied by infidels had been redeemed and put to the service of the baptized community. These new institutions were placed under the direct patronage of the local parish churches, which held liturgical cleansing ceremonies to symbolically exorcise the old faith from the stone foundations. Furthermore, the expansion of the electors' administrative infrastructure utilized the forfeited lots to accommodate the growing chamber administration. The stone houses that had served as private counting houses were converted into offices for the state's tax collectors and scribes, physically anchoring the new bureaucratic order within the heart of the old commercial districts. In Frankfurt an der Oder, the vacated properties near the Viadrina University were absorbed into the academic campus, providing lodging for the very faculty who had provided the theological justifications for the expulsion. This redistribution was meticulously recorded in the Stadtbücher, the town ledgers, which now documented the transition of ownership from the expelled Jewish financiers to the Christian elite. The legal record was adjusted to show a clean history of title, effectively airwashing the centuries of Jewish investment and construction from the official memory of the towns. The social erasure was finalized through the integration of the formerly Jewish markets into the guild-regulated Wochenmärkte. With the removal of the Jewish commercial rivals, the retailer guilds assumed total control over the retail trade of the converted quarters, enforcing the Zunftrecht with newfound rigidity. The state also implemented a policy of documentary purgation, where the old Jewish census lists and protection registers were either destroyed or archived in a manner that rendered them inaccessible to the public. By the mid-1510s, the urban landscape of Brandenburg had been successfully homogenized. The empty streets had been filled with the institutions of the state and the church, and the physical markers of the 1510 crisis had been overwritten by a narrative of municipal expansion and religious victory. This systematic conversion ensured that the expulsion was not just a removal of people, but a permanent architectural and administrative settlement that left no physical space for the community's return. The completion of the 1510 expulsion marked the beginning of a period characterized by confessional stagnation and the total homogenization of the Brandenburg demographic landscape. With the departure of the final exiles across the Oder, the Margraviate achieved a state of unitas Christiana, a religious and legal singularity that eliminated the exceptional status of the Jewish subject. This transition resulted in an immediate credit drought, as the domestic capital market collapsed in the absence of the professional financiers who had bypassed the canonical prohibitions against usury. The Brandenburg nobility, while temporarily relieved of their immediate liabilities through the state-sanctioned debt annulments, found themselves unable to secure new liquid specie for their manorial improvements or military obligations. The Ritterschaft discovered that the removal of the Jewish intermediary also removed the primary mechanism for mobilizing capital, leading to a significant contraction in the regional economy and a return to less efficient barter-based transactions. In the urban centers of Berlin and Frankfurt and der Oder, the hollowed-out nature of the economy was most visible in the declining volume of the international trade fairs. The Jewish merchant networks, which had linked the Mark to the Mediterranean and the Baltic through the Bill of Exchange, were not easily replaced by the local Krämergilden, whose operations were restricted by municipal boundaries and a lack of transnational credit lines. The Hanseatic League's influence in the region also waned as the specialized expertise in bullion assaying and currency arbitrage disappeared with the Münzjuden. The elector's treasury, despite the initial windfall from the forfeited stone houses and liquidated assets, faced a long-term decline in Schutzgeld revenues and tallages, forcing Joachim Fern Nestor to increase the fiscal pressure on the Christian burgesses and the peasantry. This shifted the social friction that had previously targeted the Jewish population toward the centralizing administration of the Hohenzollern dynasty itself. The silence of the North extended to the archival and intellectual records of the realm. The systematic documentary purgation performed by the Chancellery ensured that the centuries of Jewish contribution to the Brandenburg legal and fiscal systems were relegated to a diaspora of memory. In the eastern territories of Poland and Bohemia, the Brandenburg exiles recorded their experiences in the Memorbuch, the memory books, of the Poznan and Prague communities, creating a permanent external record of the 1510 catastrophe that contrasted with the silence of the Berlin State Archives. These chronicles documented the names and lineages of the executed and the expelled, ensuring that the Ashkenazic tradition of the Mark survived as a liturgical and historical identity outside its original geographic boundaries. Within Brandenburg, the absence of the alien subject allowed for a more rigid clerical control over the education and social conduct of the Christian populace, as the existential threat of the non-baptized had been removed. Ultimately, the immediate aftermath of the expulsion was the creation of a monocultural march, where the administrative rigidity of the early modern state was no longer challenged by legal exceptionalism. The physical erasure of the Jewish quarters and the transformation of synagogues into secular or ecclesiastical buildings finalized the urban restructuring. Brandenburg entered the 16th century as a land of religious uniformity, Yet its economic vitality was significantly compromised by the loss of the specialized class that had facilitated its integration into the continental economy. The silence was not merely a religious victory, but an economic and intellectual void that would persist for generations, until the military and fiscal crises of the mid-17th century necessitated a fundamental reversal of the 1510 policy. The expulsion thus secured the internal homogeneity of the Hohenzollern state at the cost of its commercial dynamism, leaving the Margraviate in a state of insular agrarian stability until the eventual return of international financiers under the Great Elector.